Hello everybody, my name is Noelia Castro Chao, and this presentation is entitled The Development of Impersonal Verbs in Early Modern English, a case study of hunger. This is a brief outline of my talk. This presentation is concerned with the development of a verb which in earlier English could appear in so-called impersonal constructions. Whenever I use the term impersonal, I'm referring to a specific type of morphosyntactic pattern where there is no grammatical subject and the experiencer is rather expressed by an objective pronoun in example 1. In example 2, however, the experiencer is expressed by a subjective pronoun in a personal construction. After impersonal constructions were lost, impersonal verbs followed different paths of development. In some cases, the experiencer argument is interpreted as subject, while the second argument of a stimulus, if expressed, is encoded as object, which in some cases is prepositional, as in example 3, but humanity hungers for a sense of right and wrong. In other cases, the experiencer is interpreted as object, while the stimulus is encoded as subject, as in 4. He said it pleased him. In yet other cases, the impersonal verb is used in passive patterns or is replaced by adjectival constructions, as is the case in 5. She pawed at my leg, telling me that she was hungry. In the particular case of hunger, the verb followed paths 1 and 3. And it is the purpose of this presentation to look at what the development of the verb along these paths looks like in early modern English. The frequency of impersonal constructions started to decrease in late Middle English, particularly between 1400 and 1500, although marginal instances could still be found until about 1600. There are a number of previous studies which are of particular importance for my purposes, and these are Melik-Falke 2012 and Miura 2015. Melik-Falke approaches the study of impersonals from the perspective of frame semantics, cognitive grammar, and construction grammar, and from her work I adopt, for the most part, my theoretical framework. Miura undertakes the study of Middle English verbs of emotion, although she decides to exclude the class of verbs of desire, and this is the reason why I select them as my object of study. The class of verbs of desire includes items such as ache for, crave for, desire, long for or lust after, and several of these verbs had impersonal uses in earlier English. In present-day English, the verb survives only as an archaic usage, mostly associated with religious contexts, as in 6, when he, meaning Jesus Christ, had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he afterwards hungered. The adjectival construction be hungry has come to be largely preferred in more stylistically neutral contexts, as in 7. He can now recognize when he is hungry and cry for food. Hunger has 3 different senses, and these are to feel hunger, to desire, and to subject to hunger. And of particular importance for my purposes are the first 2 senses, because as I shall discuss in a minute, these are the only ones I find attested in the dataset. The sense to feel hunger is metaphorically related to the sense to desire. There is a process of semantic transference such that the second sense is derived from the first, and this transference process involves a change from the domain of physical sensation to the domain of emotion. The literal sense to feel hunger pertains to the semantic domain of physical sensation and has the semantic frame feeler, needer, where only the feeler is lexically profiled. In the sense to desire, however, hunger belongs to the semantic domain of emotion and has the semantic frame desire, desired, where 2 arguments are lexically profiled. As may be observed, the semantic transference involves a change in the verb's valency from 1 argument to 2 arguments. The sense to feel hunger is conceived of as a state. In terms of force dynamics, the state of affairs may be said to lack dynamicity and control. In 11, for instance, there is no initiator which starts or stops the sensation of hunger in a controlled manner, and instead, the sensation seems to overwhelm the experiencer in a rather spontaneous way. Consequently, there is no dynamic relationship holding between an intentional initiator and an affected endpoint. By contrast, the sense to desire denotes a process, and the state of affairs is dynamic and controlled in this case. In example 12, for instance, there is an initiator which is responsible for directing attention to the object of desire in a controlled manner. That is, he intentionally directs attention towards a sense of self-worth, and therefore a dynamic relationship may be said to hold between an intentional initiator and an endpoint, which in the particular case of hunger turns out to be unaffected. In this context, the aims of my research are four. Firstly, I aim to carry out a diachronic analysis of the senses conveyed by hunger in the early modern English period. Secondly, to describe the frequency of occurrence of the complementation patterns found with hunger. Thirdly, to analyze the syntactic and semantic development of hunger, paying special attention to its decline in frequency and the parallel surge of the adjectival construction be hungry. And lastly, I wish to assess which factors may have influenced the direction of the development of the verb, as well as the adjectival construction in early modern English, focusing in particular on one research question. And this is, what are the motivations behind the competition between hunger and the adjectival construction be hungry for the expression in particular of the physical sensation sense to feel hunger? Competition between both modes of expression is illustrated in 13 and 14. The data and methodology are corpus-based. The data are extracted from EBO Corp, which is Peter Petrel's offline conversion of EBO. Given the massive size of this corpus, what I did was to carry out a random sample in order to create a set of subcorpora of comparable size. The distribution of this subcorpus is shown in Table 1. It is broken down into 50 years of periods covering the span 1500–1700, and it is distributed into 891 total texts. On the other hand, the Oxford English Dictionary and Middle English Dictionary entry quotations were used as a means to check spelling variation and syntactic use. The examples were retrieved using Anconc and they were manually pruned. I retrieved a total of 331 examples for analysis, 193 corresponding to hunger and 138 to be hungry. In this section, I delve into the discussion of corpus data. In Figure 1, I display the diachronic development of the senses of hunger in early modern English, and a couple of observations can be drawn from the data. Firstly, the sense to feel hunger tends to decrease in the course of early modern English. In parallel, the sense to desire tends to increase instead. There is one extra label which is overlapping. I'm going to explain in a minute what this refers to. In example 15, I illustrate the literal sense to feel hunger. He should feel it to them which hunger. In 16, I illustrate the metaphorical sense. It maketh us to hunger and thirst after righteousness. Then there is this overlapping category, a label which I adopt from Robinson 2010. In this sense, the verb can be alternatively paraphrased as to hunger for or to desire spiritual salvation, and it accommodates examples which cannot be clearly ascribed to any of the other two senses. In 17, for instance, to the intent we may hunger after this bread of life. What happens here is that reference is being made to a hunger that is purely physical, that is, a hunger for bread. But in the context of religious texts, this is metaphorically interpreted as spiritual salvation, and therefore these examples partake of both the literal domain and the metaphorical domain of emotion. In Table 2, I look at the complementation patterns of hunger in early modern English. On the one hand, prepositional complements are the predominant pattern and tend to increase throughout the period. On the other hand, one-place complementation comes second and tends to decrease instead. One-place complementation makes reference to patterns where the second argument is unexpressed. From a semantic perspective, whereas prepositional complements correlate with the metaphorical or overlapping senses, as illustrated in 18, one-place complementation correlates with the literal sense, as shown in 19. This follows from differences in the number of profile arguments by each of the verb's senses. Another finding to be pointed out concerns the competition observed between the verb hunger and the adjectival construction be hungry. For instance, in Figure 2, I display the relative frequency of hunger and be hungry in the sense to feel hunger, and it may be observed that as the verb declines, the adjectival construction increases instead. However, in Figure 3, I look at the relative frequency in the sense to desire, and in this case, it is the verb that remains clearly predominant throughout the period. What this means is that hunger declines in parallel to the rise of the adjectival construction be hungry, but this happens only in the literal sense to feel hunger, but not in the metaphorical sense. What I'm going to do now is to address the research question I put forward earlier. And this is, what are the motivations behind the competition between hunger and be hungry for the expression of the literal sense? Before I put forward a hypothesis, some comments need to be made regarding the semantics of the adjectival construction. I'm going to do this from a force dynamic perspective. From this standpoint, the participants involved in a state of affairs may be said to represent either one of 2 points of a chain, which are the initiator on the one hand and the endpoint on the other, as shown in Figure 4. In terms of this schema, I'm going to contrast adjectival constructions with the active use of verbs. The use of verbs in the active voice commonly, though not always, involves the presence of a controlling initiator. In 20, for instance, she worried. She is viewed as responsible for directing her attention towards an unexpressed object of worry, and therefore the construction involves a dynamic and controlled state of affairs. By contrast, in the case of the adjectival construction, the primary participant is not viewed as responsible for triggering the emotion, and turns out to be merely affected by the internal change of state. In 21, for instance, she was worried. In this case, the state of affairs is non-dynamic, uncontrolled, and therefore conceptualized as stative. On this assumption, the hypothesis I propose is that the increase in frequency of the adjectival construction only in the sense to feel hunger may be at least partly motivated by a semantic match between the lexical semantics of this verb sense and the semantics of the adjectival construction itself. You may remember that the sense to feel hunger involves a state of affairs that is stative and uncontrolled, and therefore it is preferably expressed by the adjectival construction be hungry, which assigns a stative and uncontrolled interpretation as well. So to conclude, The present study has dealt with the syntactic and semantic development of the impersonal verb hunger in early modern English. Hunger undergoes a process of metaphorical extension involving a change from the original meaning to feel hunger to the metaphorical one to desire. Syntactically, prepositional complements are the predominant pattern and grow at the expense of one-place complementation. On the other hand, in the course of the period, the verb is subject to competition with be hungry, especially in the sense to feel hunger, and this may be due to the fact that the sense to feel hunger, which is inherently stative and uncontrolled, shows a preference for adjectival constructions which likewise assign a stative and uncontrolled interpretation to the state of affairs. These are the references. And the acknowledgements. I thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions or comments you may have.